This is Watts's last major work. And I've always felt that to begin a canvas this size in one's 88th year either shows great faith or not a little foolishness. But he was determined to record his impression of the dawn of the new age, the new century. It's titled Progress. It is the dawn of the 20th century. If you look back at Victorian history, late Victorian history, you notice after a while that they were tired of their century. They simply couldn't wait for the new century to come, and the advertisers all latched onto it. And you find that companies and articles are called the New Century. You get the New Century Patent Steam Carpet Cleaning Company. The New Century Patent Steel Corset will not bend under any circumstances. And so Watts, naturally enough, had his throw at it. And he starts with the fairly traditional manner of a new dawn, the rider on the white horse coming out of the sunrise. But being Watts, of course, he has to take it further than that and illustrate the reaction of a cross-section of humanity to this extraordinary event. And so, in the foreground here, you have the scholar, the old man, buried in the past, with the stub of his candle just about to go out on him and not even noticing that. You see, Watts had no formal education himself, so he very naturally and quite rightly deeply distrusted some of those who had. I've always felt it was advantageous that he didn't have a formal education. It would have rubbed off a great deal of the originality. And then, unfortunately, the least finished part of the picture is again one of his pet themes, the rich man in his besmirched cloth of gold, grubbing in the muck for yet more money. There are many occasions when I wish Watts had perhaps finished his pictures a little less. He overworked many of them. In fact, he spoiled a number of them with the highest motives, simply wishing to improve them. But this is the sort of antidote where I long for him to have gone just a little further with it. But I'm afraid either the Grim Reaper or the sorrowing mother intervened before he could. And then in the corner at the bottom is another of his pet hates, the sluggard. Watts himself rose at 4 or 5:30 every morning so that he could begin work as soon as the light was sufficient. And you see the sluggard is turning over, shading his eyes from the radiance of the new century, going back to sleep. But there's one, the stalwart young British working man, who turns round and actually notices what's going on. In spite of its unfinished state, I still think it's a pretty stunning picture. I think I've mentioned before that Watts was frequently ahead and aside of his time. It was because he followed his own line all the time. Many people who should know better, and those who don't know at all, often call him a pre-Raphaelite. Well, we simply don't do that. He knew them all. He admired them, he admired their work, he painted portraits of them, knew them socially, but he was never involved. The difficulty and the difference with Watts is that he didn't found a group, he didn't belong to one, he always followed his own line. And so you get oddities appearing from time to time. And here is a curious picture whose official title is After the Deluge, the 41st Day, the rising of the sun over the waters after the flood, beginning to dry things up. And Watts's idea with it was to try and convey the immense power of the sun without actually painting a flaming sphere in the center of it. When it was painted, he got letters from people saying they could see the face of the Almighty in the center of it. And he was a very nice man, Mr. Watts, always very polite. And he said, well, it's possible. I've left it for you to interpret yourself. You may see the sun, you may see anything in the center of it. Who knows the power there is there? But the interesting thing to me about it is that if one was told it was painted in Paris or Munich or Vienna in 1900, it wouldn't cause the faintest surprise. But in fact, it was painted in a leafy backwater of Kensington in 1884 by a staid old gentleman called George Frederick Watts. And it was because of his asideness to everything that he suffered. He once said in desperation, why is it in England one is never allowed to be original? One always has to be influenced. And I quite understand what he means. Being original in England is so often called being too clever by half. And people will look at Watts's work sometimes and say, oh, you can see the influence of Burne-Jones upon Watts. And I say, on the contrary, it was the other way around. Watts took Burne-Jones under his wing for a year and taught him to draw. And then people who are really clever will look and say, you can see the influence of Vaudelain-Redon upon Watts. And I say, well, afraid not. Because you see, Watts exhibited this picture with several others at the Paris Universal Exhibition of 1889, which incidentally is when, I believe, when the Eiffel Tower was built as a marker in history. And Redon, as a young man, saw this picture and was inordinately influenced by it, to the extent of even writing to Watts and telling him how much he was influenced by it. And so, dear old George Frederick Watts, that staid gentleman in the leafy backwater of Kensington, becomes a sort of honorary uncle to all these bright and upcoming young sprigs of the European Symbolist movement.